Welcome to That RPG podcast, where every great adventure starts with a single idea. I'm DQ, your friendly neighborhood GM.
I'm Courtney, a true patriot.
And I'm Johnny Law, and I live to tread.
As we're thinking about the prospect of tyranny at a much larger level, at the global level, there's a question of tyranny at our tables. And so our dear GM today focuses on how you, as a GM, can try not to be as much of an asshole. So our dear GM reads, I'm worried I'm becoming a tyrant at the table. My players are mostly engaged, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being too harsh. I don't want to coddle them, but I also don't want to leave them demoralized. I'm tempted to fudge dice when the encounters get too tough. How can I keep the game challenging without crossing the line into cruelty? So it is a valid concern, because when we think about what a GM can do and their purpose, like there's a massive power imbalance between the GM and the players. And that's just natural to most systems. Some systems aren't like that, where the GM has very directed options, like PBTA. They have specific things they can do at certain times they can do them. And there are other systems where there isn't really a GM, or it's been divided into the players. But ours is not like that. Ours has a very powerful GM that is more of an arbitrator and a dictator in that sense. Dictator meaning dictating the rules. So I'm gonna try not to prattle on too long. I'm gonna give you a couple of points, and then I'm going to thread in my other points as we discuss. But the first thing I want to talk about is that power imbalance, and to be mindful of that. So there are things you can do, I think, to mediate your own power. A couple of things that I think about at the very right off the jump is, and this is something that you can do, you don't have to, but I try not to look at my players' sheets at all, or to understand what their abilities are, because my goal as a GM is to try and prevent myself from biasing myself as much as possible, whether subconsciously or consciously. This is the same as when you're trying to not favor a particular player in the spotlight. If I don't know what's in your sheets, I can't design counters to your abilities. And so often what happens to me, which I think is fun, is there's very surprising things that happen because I didn't know you had that ability. And I'm like, oh, wow, okay. Or sometimes you'll have chosen something very narrow that solves the problem at hand instantly. And, that might deflate my feelings at the moment as a GM, because I'm like, oh, I had a really complicated thing for that. But that player's going to feel great because their very targeted choice paid off. Now, there are times when you need to be careful, like if you're designing a mystery, and something that comes to mind is mind reading, right? If someone has mind reading, that could be a real problem if they're just going to mind read all of your suspects. So that's a case where you want to be aware that certain abilities could be used and think about how they're going to play in your adventure. Now, that's a whole different discussion. How do you deal with mind reading and mystery? But that's an example of one where you would want to think about that ability and not necessarily look at the player's abilities, but to remember that's possible. Remember that your players only control one thing in the world, and that's their character. So you don't want to step on their toes in their agency. And by that, I mean, don't tell them what they think. There are moments when their character involuntarily will be subject to something, in which case you'll describe it, but give them complete autonomy over their character.
I'd say I definitely differ in my approach with, I like to know, both as a player and as a GM, what's at the table besides what I'm bringing. And as a GM, though, I do agree with what you're saying, that because then you don't want to, like, haha, you can't use this because I know you have this, like that, just is to do that, especially if that's all you're ever doing. But for the actual opposite reason, I kind of want to be like, oh, you have these things. I'm going to just put out opportunities to, like, you haven't done anything in this kind of representing this thing that you used to. So now I'm going to try to make more opportunities available for you to play with that thing. Not to railroad anything, not to handhold, but just to be aware of, like, you want to play this way. Let me make sure I have these opportunities to play this way. But I do 100% agree with you, DQ, that it is a very slippery slope, because you can then either, just lock people into a certain role, or have a bias in general and just, start to lock them out of things that you don't necessarily mean to, but you're trying to set up an encounter and trying to create a challenge. So therefore you're going to put barriers in front of them. It's kind of like the opposite of meta gaming, or is it meta gaming, I guess?
I mean, I guess it's standpoint. But what you're saying is, if you're very mindful and you're coming with the right intentions, then it could be helpful to tailor the adventure to make use of their abilities, and that can work. You just got to be really careful.
To an extent, Daniel, I feel like you do that just not mechanically. You do it more like the interests of the player and their character, as opposed to like focusing on, oh, they have this spell, so I should try to do something towards that. But like if a character worships a certain god, you'll try to weave that in and such. One thing that made me cringe a little bit when you were reading that off was tempted to fudge the dice when encounters got too tough. And like I've never GM'd, so I can't speak from that point of view. And I can see that maybe it would be tempting to do that if you keep rolling just constant crits or something. I think if you feel like encounters are too tough, you should just scale them back a little bit rather than messing with the whatever the dice might show you. Like, let's say you have an encounter where the party barely survives, everybody's been brought down to like no hit points, their armor's destroyed, weapons are falling apart, casters are out of magic points, then yeah, maybe it's time to like ease back and give them a break. On the other hand, maybe it's also a matter of like looking at how each side is approaching things. Is the party too focused on just charging in, punching the baddies without doing any strategic prep work beforehand? If that's the case, then maybe encourage them to do that sort of thing. Like have them chat outside of the game and be like, okay, we're facing this big bad next time. Like what can we do to make our lives easier on that front? In that way, you can also kind of forecast things for them, like leave hints about what they might be up for next so that they can prepare a bit. Like if they know that they're going to be venturing into a volcano where there's like fire elemental things, then maybe they want to get some like fire resistant stuff or some like ice related weaponry or spells that can impact their enemy, the things that they're going to be fighting. But I would say probably don't fudge the dice themselves.
Yeah, I think fudging the dice that breaks the social contract. That breaks the whole one of the tenets of the games that we're playing. And there's so many other things you can fudge, as far as like causing a distraction or the riders of Rodan come in and save the day or something, or the BBG decides to capture you instead of kill you, or there's so many different ways to change the outcome or lessen it without straight up lying. I will say I did fudge dice once in my life. It was against two 9-year-old girls, though. So I think that was a valid thing. I was rolling for damage on a spell, and it probably would have taken them to 0, which I didn't want to have to then explain to them how this little monster is now standing over her lifeless body. Yeah, it just seemed like it was a better thing to just, you know, pretend that didn't happen. But I still, obviously, I felt bad about it, and I still think about it. And now if I was to play again with them, and they're 11-year-old girls, oh, they'd get the full brunt of that 6. They'd learn a lesson.
When it comes down to it, and I don't know why this is a controversial discussion in RPG forums, fudging the dice is cheating, plain and simple. In an RPG, there are not many ways to cheat, especially for the GM who arbitrarily has power over everything, except for fudging the dice. Fudging the dice is the equivalent of railroading. You're taking away their meaningful choice because whatever you change the numbers to, you're determining the outcome. It destroys any trust that the players have in you as an impartial GM because you're deliberately favoring what you want to have happen. And it deflates tension, which is exactly what you guys are talking about. Like when you're fudging the dice, that means you've reached your lowest point. You're no longer playing the game. And just John has said, you've broken the social contract. And I don't know, there's no justification for it. I've heard so many justifications. Those justifications are usually Zennials might call a skill issue, is what it is. And I have no qualms saying that because I think the second you fudge the dice, there's something wrong with how you're running the game. Or as you were saying, there's something happening at the table that's preventing you from running it efficiently. Maybe your players have the wrong expectation and they're running in a horror game to fight everything when really they should be careful and not be fighting as a failing state in that case, for example. Related to fudging the dice are questions of how you're going to behave when you're handling the rules. This question's asking for what is a sort of mechanical solution to this problem of me overwhelming my table. But I think the reality is it's not a mechanical solution. The solution is social, and the solution has to do with how you run the game as a GM. So by that, I mean, to avoid being a tyrant, how you engage with the players needs to change. So you have to check yourself. Like when think about when the players have a disagreement on how a rule works or uncertainty. When you talk to them about it, you've got to enter the table as if everyone's opinion is equal, even though you have the final say. So what I try to do is listen to everyone's opinion on the interpretation of the rule, solicit possible interpretations, consider any plan that they're thinking about with open-mindedness, no matter how absurd it is. And then once you've heard all that feedback, you make a ruling, and maybe your ruling is wrong, but you're not, the point then is not to argue with them at length. I mean, you might have a bit of back and forth to understand their point of view, but once you have enough information to make a ruling, you make a ruling, and if it was wrong, you rectify it later. And I think part of what not being a tyrant means is being willing to be wrong or uncertain. That's what housekeeping is for, admitting that you made a bad ruling, or that you misinterpreted something, or that maybe we should try something differently. And you're not invulnerable to getting the rules wrong. And so once you admit that, it creates more trust in you at the table, I think. And it shows that you're not a tyrant. You're trying to do things in the best comportment with the system, just like the rest of the players trying to adhere to the rules.
Yeah, and speaking to that sort of like open communication and basically humility in a way is like in the question they talk about, I can't shake the feeling I'm being too harsh, don't want to leave them demoralized. One of the obvious things you can do is just ask them, like, how are you all feeling about the game? Like, are you getting annoyed by these encounters? Because maybe your players are actually into it. They like the challenge. They don't mind getting smacked around a lot and being on the verge of death all the time. On the other hand, yeah, maybe you are sensing something that is actually there, and some of the players are feeling frustrated that they can't kind of act out their fantasy as they want to, and it's all about just talking openly about it and letting people know you're not going to get offended if somebody says like, hey, that felt really harsh, or hey, that session didn't end up feeling very fun, more so just punishing.
In regards to questioning rules, I will say to all the players out there, by all means, call out your GM, but also know when to shut up and let it just sit, because it's their decision. Like that's it. No matter how much you can whine, now you're just whining and you're bringing everyone down. That isn't to say you can't after the game bring things back up or have discussions either post game or later in private conversations, or even say like how you think things are unfair or whatever. And as DQ said, a good GM will show humility and either admit they're wrong or see your viewpoint and say, sorry, it's not how it works. Like it's just there's a certain point where it's just like you got to stop. You can't. There's no reason to hold a grudge or just like grumble in the corner. Like cool, now no one's having fun.
Well, there's rules of engagement, right? Like I want the players to challenge rulings in the moment, because I will forget things. I often, if you just applied a status effect and I just resolved 3 different players' interactions, I most likely forgot about that. That's why you guys have to be on top of that and remind me, oh no, you still have a disadvantage, or oh no, you have the status effect on you, because it helps me. And I'm like, oh, thanks. Okay, let's make sure we fix that, and we can revise the roll on the fly. And like you're saying, there's rules of engagement. Like when for example, if I'm with Chris and he's the GM, and I have a question about the rules, I'll put it to him like saying, "Hey, what do you think that this could work like this?" Or, "Oh, I have this ability. Does that apply?" Even if I know that I'm right, you want to phrase it to the GM, because the GM then can look at it, and you're not being an antagonist about it. You're kind of like posing it to them, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's right." It's about how you engage that sets the tone. And so I think in this question, it might be that this GM is not, like you're saying, Courtney, listening to the players and how they're feeling and just dictating, and so they don't really know, do they feel bad or good. They're breaking the rules of engagement, aren't there?
And we don't know the full story either. We're just here for the GM's perspective because, like, as you said, that's a great way to approach GM with, like, okay, I know this is right, but like, I want to make sure because it's kind of throwing a needle. And I've definitely used that technique, but more often than not, I use the no, this is the full. That's how things work. Like, and obviously, I'll grumble if it's not accepted, but once again, you got to let it go. And I can't remember. Actually, I can remember one instance way back when we first started doing scene checks, and there was something that did not line up, and I was like, no, because the whole plan was based around that. And you know what happened? We got through it somehow. People might have died, but it wasn't a PC, so who cares? Some random pirate person might have died, whatever. But overall, though, you'll get over it. The game, the story continues. It's not a big deal. Now, I have a quick question regarding when they're saying they want to make they're talking about fudging dice to not make the encounters tough. My thought to that, which I kind of touched on briefly, was like when I think of encounters that might be too tough, I tend to put some fail safes into it either way. Like I put a knob that I can crank it up to make it a little bit more dangerous, and I put a condition or something that I can use to pull it back a bit. And like kind of if the tempos go, if it's starting to go like crazy, unless they're putting themselves in a situation where they can get killed, I think that's fine. But if I'm putting them in, it's like I don't feel right, and especially the one game I run, the tone of it doesn't seem right to put people all of a sudden in this like life or death situation, unless I've hinted towards it or that feeling is coming. What are your thoughts towards that kind of approach of fudging, not actually changing the dice roll, but maybe changing the structure of the encounter?
Like you said with the before, it can be a slippery slope. Like for example, with reviewing their sheets and making sure that the challenges match up. If I think if the dials are there and predefined how they work for you, you're not making up anything on the fly. You're appealing to it. It's written out. It's preset. So it's not like an outcome that you're trying to shift. If you create them on the fly to shift the outcome, now you're railroading. But if so for example, say you have an encounter, right? And and it must make fictional sense. And say it's like you're in a frozen cliffside and you're going to fight a Yeti or something. And the Yeti's really powerful, but they're a level 1. And you're not sure how it's going to go and you're afraid. Now, the first impulse should be like, well, let's see what happens. But if you want to make, if this isn't a huge important battle and really the adventure moves on beyond this, you don't want it to end because of something stupid like this, you could, for example, have a landslide environmental dial, right? So when they're fighting it, there's certain conditions that trigger it that have to do with the creature or the length of time clocks, for example, that could cause the landslide to happen, maybe push it off, the cliff. That's one way to do it, but you've got to be super careful that you're not triggering it based on how you want the scenario to end.
Yeah, because then what's the point? You're just telling a story instead of acting one out. Yeah.
Giving players hints at what the possibilities are in a situation, like for the landslide or avalanche example, like saying that they start to hear like rumbling or something as the fight starts and they feel uneasy on the ground or whatever, just to like give them a sense of what's going to happen too, so that all of a sudden 5 turns in, it's just like, oh yeah, the avalanche comes and wipes the Yeti off. Like you can continue on your journey, because that wouldn't be very satisfactory for them either. Going along with the player's creativity and problem solving and like letting them do things that maybe aren't 100% by the book, depending on what system you're in. OSR Plus definitely allows for a lot of that creative problem solving, but I know that like 5e and other games are a bit more traditional and focused on solving things just by fighting. But when you are in a more flexible game, like it becomes less a matter of, okay, I just need to go in and like wail on this enemy until it dies. And there are more factors that you can use, like the environment. Maybe you can loosen a chandelier above them so that it falls on them, or take advantage of stuff that you've noticed. Basically, like reward players for getting into character and noticing things and keeping things in mind. Like if you describe things about the scene that they pick up on and want to use, then go with that. Don't be like, oh, you can't actually like pick up those barrels. They're just there for scenery. Like let them do interesting things, and that might also help the issue of encounters feeling too tough if you just give them more ways to solve an encounter.
Like I think part of it too is just like we're letting go of the idea that we have to play by the book, we've got to let go in general as a GM. Like when you enter the scenario, you know, sure, there's that cool ability you wanted to use, or you wanted this particular monster to survive because you have some other goals, or you want this event to happen, but you have to let go that those things may not happen. They need to not be critical. Nothing must be critical. So if you can let go when you go in, then you're not worried about being frustrated. And I think part of it is GMs being precious about certain things. Like, so for example, we just had a playtest with our first playtest with the Red Dragon, right? I deliberately did not want to be attached to any of the creatures in the scenario or any of its abilities. So I wanted to just run it as if it is what it is. And, if it died very quickly, well, then that's probably a mechanical problem we can solve later. But in running it, I don't want to get attached to, oh, I have to have the dragon use this particular ability because it's so neat. Maybe it's not going to get to use that ability. Maybe they roll up with cold resistance and you can't do jack shit for 2 hours. hours. You know, like, so you've got to think of doing something else, but you got to let go of those, kill your darlings, as it were. And the other thing I wanted to add, about dials, um, one thing that seems like a dial but is actually railroading is, for example, adjusting HP on the fly. That's something that I hear a lot of GMs saying, oh well, I'll just give him a few more HP so he lasts longer, so it's more cinematic, or oh, I'll just let him die because he's only got 5 hit points left. So, like, there's reasons why you might just let the creature die early. Maybe this is dragging on, and just from a play perspective, it's getting tedious. But when you're adjusting their hit points on the fly, I mean, that's not any different than adjusting the dice, right? Because if you give them more hit points, you're saying, I want them to last longer because I want this outcome to be a certain way, as opposed to they just get hit and they die. So I wouldn't consider those dials in the way that, for example, adding things that are options, tools for you to deploy into the scenario that are fictionally appropriate. That's the dial, because that's saying, okay, it makes fictional sense that this would come into play now, or that the pod plant monsters, little seeds will open up and it's the pod people will come out and it adds more creatures. But you designed that in advance. You're not just adding it because you don't like how the scenario is going.
The one interesting idea I did here is, and this involves more Dungeon Master controlled PCs, which is already a whole nother topic that we'll leave for another time, and I'm not really for it at all. At least the ones that act this way, but not giving extra HP, but instead of having a NPC have the killing blow, have it like be the staggering blow, and then letting someone else jump in for the killing blow. And I feel like that's like, if you're already in that position where you have things that can do that, which I think is dumb to begin with, but whatever, here we are, then I can kind of see that element of fudging.
Well, and even in our system, we've got rules to prevent NPCs from doing that safely, right? So that they can't actually advance the narrative. Yeah.
That's not a universal thing, like a lot of people, and that's not a way. I mean, that's one. You go to any RPG horror story, and you see all these people talking about the DM PCs and whatever, like how it's just it's a horrible concept. It's a horrible concept, and which is handled with OSR plus. But I think changing the tempo in that way, if you're already in that situation where like, oh, I didn't mean this rock to fall and kill him, not killing it but leaving it, it's on death's door. It's gonna die unless no one does anything. It's gonna die regardless. But allowing the player to have that last heroic moment, or especially if it's like someone's nemesis. Like, I don't. Do you think that's a bad idea to mess with that kind of railroading, so to speak?
So you're saying, like, say a character has a nemesis villain, like maybe a big boss or BBEG, and they're in the final fight, and we want the player who is the nemesis of that character to have a killing blow.
Well, not that
or-
but like the person that goes right before them has like a crazy crit, and it just like cascades, and they obliterate them. Like you just.
I mean, my sticking to my guns, like, I'm not going to fudge the dice. If the other player ends up killing them before the player who wanted to do it, that's just how the cookie crumbles, right?
But would you allow the something within the narrative, like the player to do the standing over and
Oh
shooting
yeah,
head, kind
that's
of like
totally fine. We
allow
could
that kind of
say, yeah. I think that makes sense. Like, let's say your buddy actually got him to 0 and he falls down. Technically, he's dead as far as the system's concerned. But narratively, you could say, like, oh, he's breathing and he's dying of his mortal wound, and then the player goes over and kills him. That's cool cinematic.
That's what I
moment.
was getting at.
Yeah,
That change of tempo, like if like all of a sudden you're there, but like let's let this other guy finish the race.
Or when
as
a
well.
player dies, like if they're dead, you can give them that last moment to say something, even if it's like 3 hours later, because narratively, who cares? We want to give them the whole point of playing the game is to fulfill like whatever role we are as a character. But on adventure cadence in general, like, another thing to be concerned about when you're structuring your adventures is, if I'm going to have encounter, it's going to get exhausting really quickly. If I'm going to have downtime, the players who want some combat are going to be bored out of their minds. And it speaks to the expectations of the game that you set up to begin with. But that cadence is a way of making things not feel punishing. In OSR Plus, for example, there's a number of game modes that you can switch between as a GM. You have exploration mode, which is when you're just exploring an environment. You have downtimes, which are more social interactions. They may involve journeys, montages, those kind of things for which there are mechanics. There's encounters, which are generally battles or trap-laden situations where there's lots of skills and mechanical bits applied. And there's the overworld where we're dealing with what's happening to the world outside the players. And strategically switching between those, that's a way to control how your players are feeling. If you just had a really intense 3-hour battle last game, the next game you might want to do downtime, a bit of exploration, and look at the overworld because that punctuates, experience A and B, or experience A and C with B.
Speaking to the players feeling demoralized because of cadence and stuff, like I've definitely had experiences where, as a player in a game, thinking to one game in particular that was advertised as like a dark horror game, and I think the GM just had a different view of what horror would be, and it ended up feeling more like there was just never a way to truly succeed at anything. Like everything had a downside. Even if you rolled really well in certain cases, your reward was just noticing something shitty happening first. Just didn't feel good to play very much, which is unfortunate because I really liked the world and the characters and the overall plot, but it just felt like every game was like, well, how are we going to get over this time? And that's not fun either. If you do feel like you're demoralizing your players, especially if players actually tell you like, hey, this is like way too dark, please bring in some levity or less punishing something, then yeah, definitely take a break from that. Let them have some downtime, chat with townspeople, give them something more pleasant to do, even if it's a fairly minor task, because that can help break up the horrific things happening otherwise.
I mean, I think that the main thing is just you want to make sure you have plenty of freedom as a GM, that you're not being, your actions aren't being held back.
Thanks for listening to That RPG Podcast, where every great adventure starts with a single idea. Join us next week for more from Don't Fudge the Dice, how to maximize free action in your RPG adventures, where we talk about tariffs in tabletop gaming, how to balance encounters and build tyrannical BBEGs, and explore the Outer Wilds in a Spelljammer-adjacent adventure.